Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I have a very special interview planned for you today. I've been talking here and there in different interviews and in certain moments on the show about what's called the Yuga Cycle, and an interesting conversation about this in regard to how it may relate to some of the different events we're seeing in the world, and a larger discussion about sort of a potential cataclysmic end or of different cycles of our evolution of the human species. And so I decided to invite Bibhu Dev Misra that I've been recently referencing his amazing book called Yuga Shift that I've been reading to discuss what this is and what it means and how it may relate, whether you believe it or not, to things that are happening today. So first, just to invite you on, I'd like to say welcome to the show, Bibhu. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks. Thanks for having me on the show, Ryan. I'm
I
excited
really,
to be talking about the Yuga Cycle.
yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, we'll get into why today in particular is a very important date in all of this. And I find this to be very profound and interesting. The more like I go at these things in a lot of sense from I'm very open to different ideas well outside kind of like what most people think is real or understand. But at the same time, I come at these things from a very, worldly political kind of perspective on how it affects the world today, open to both sides of it. But as I read through this, man, it's like, and shout out to your work in particular in this larger conversation, the amount of source material, which my audience knows I'm very, very important to me, the amount of connection to historical events, it's mind-blowing to see how much this relates. And I'm sure we'll get into all of that as we go through. I would like to just read some stuff to kind of set the tone. It's basically from a recent article you put out, but it references some passages in your book just to kind of set people's minds in this. And then we can get into what this really means. Now, as you wrote, it says, as we approach March 21st, today, 2025, and enter the period of transition, the dense energies of the Kali Yuga begin to slowly dissipate. As a result, the tyrants will begin to lose some of their powers. Lies and corruption will get exposed. Skeletons will tumble out of closets. Disclosures will come thick and fast, and many ignored and malign truths will bubble to the surface. The process of churn and chaos will create more polarization, and the increased desperation of the elites can lead to the outbreak of more wars and violence in the world. And you quote from the book, as the Kali Yuga energies will be on the wane after 2025, the tyrants and dictators who control the affairs of the world may begin to find that their evil plans are no longer coming to fruition as easily as before. Their lies will get exposed. Their propaganda will no longer be as effective, and their wicked schemes for gaining more profit and control will be disrupted. They may face increasing opposition from people around the world who will begin to stand up for themselves and demand an end to the deceptions, injustices, exploitation of resources, instigated revolutions, and false flag terror attacks. Humanity may become more polarized than ever before, leading to greater social and economic instability and taking us closer to the next world war. And you continue in the article, there seems to be an almost unreal zeal right now in the Western world for going ahead with AI technologies, digital currencies, and nanotech-based mRNA vaccines. And it is also no secret that the current aggressive rhetoric for acquiring land and mineral resources is for the purpose of supporting these new ventures. No point for guessing where all this could eventually lead. An AI-regulated beast system where people are chipped and injected with nanosensors for monitoring and influencing their thoughts and physiology on a real-time basis, thereby taking us further and further away from our connection to our inner divinity, to community, to nature and the cosmic consciousness. That's the Kali Yuga endgame. And you finish by saying, in other words, there could be a time in the near future, possibly around 2029 or 2030, when every person will have to make a choice. Does he go with the technology-dominated dystopian world of surveillance and control, which will be promoted as a golden age, or does he align with the inner spirit and the sacred wisdom of his ancestors, and thus the natural laws that bring about the gradual unfolding of consciousness and our spiritual abilities in the ascending cycle? We must choose wisely if and when that moment comes, for it will be the most important choice that we will be making in this incarnation. So thank you for humoring me of listening to your own words. I thought it was a really important point to start with, because my audience will probably be falling out of their chair if they haven't heard about any of this, because of how much that connects back with a lot of what we're talking about. And so I think it's really important for them to think about this in the context of the world events that we're seeing. And I really did think that article brought a lot of this together, even more so for me than the book. So thank you again for being here today. Let's start wherever you'd really like. I think it's best probably just to explain what the Kali Yuga is, or excuse me, the Yuga cycle is, and the Kali Yuga point at which we're in that cycle and everything else. But please start wherever you'd like.
Well, Ryan, the concept of the Yuga cycle or the cycle of the ages was not exclusive only to India or to Greeks or Persia. It was known all over the world. people everywhere believed in a cyclical framework of history, and it's only in the last 300 odd years of industrial revolution that people started thinking that we are moving in a linear pattern towards increasing growth and prosperity. And in this particular cycle, we basically devolve from a state of ascended consciousness when all people live in a state of enlightenment, and the natural environment also reflects that prosperity and that abundance back to us. And then we devolve from the state of enlightened consciousness. We devolve in stages. So you have the golden age when everything is perfect. It's almost an utopia on earth. Then we move to the silver age, which is called Treta Yuga in the Indian system. Then the bronze age, which is called the Dwapara Yuga. And then you have two back-to-back Kali Yugas or iron ages. And we right now are at the fag end of the Kali Yuga, of the second Kali Yuga, which is the ascending Kali Yuga. That is where we are right now in terms of our civilization. And everything that we know about our histories, right from Egypt or Sumer or from Indus Valley, that's all a part of the 6,000 year back-to-back Kali Yugas. So we basically don't have any historical knowledge, any documented historical information of the higher ages, apart from the writings of some of the ancient philosophers. Like you have Plato's writings about the Golden Age in Greece. In India, you have some of the Puranas or the Ramayana talking about how the conditions of life were in the higher ages. But apart from that, you hardly have any kind of archaeological evidence or inscriptions. You don't have anything like that. So most of our historical knowledge about the past is basically two back-to-back iron ages. And we have become accustomed to thinking that this is how life must have been in the past as well, based on what we have seen in the recent evolution of the Iron Age, or what we know about the Bronze Age civilizations. So we are right now at what we call as the kind of cusp. Actually, today we transition out of the Kali Yuga. So it's a very important day for us in that sense, because Kali Yuga is the age of darkness. It's the age of ignorance about our true spiritual and divine origins, about the true origins of human civilization itself, and about our true potential and the true purpose why we have incarnated on this planet at all. Because the current paradigm is that we are just flesh and blood, we don't have a soul, and our purpose is only to accumulate more wealth and power and prosperity, and after you die, that's the end of it. Whereas the ancient paradigm was very different, wherein you go through many cycles of reincarnation, and ultimately you come into your own divine being. You basically recover your divine heritage, and then you exit this reincarnation cycle and you take on positions of responsibility elsewhere in the universe. So that was the paradigm that the ancients spoke about, and the new paradigm is completely opposite of that. So as we are coming out of the Kali Yuga, what we can expect to see is the crumbling of the old systems, the old beliefs, the old paradigms. They're going to shatter, and because the new energies have already started coming into our planet, and we'll talk about what those energies are. And since those energies have already coming into our planet, there's going to be an intuitive awakening of people. So people will be able to figure it out for themselves without having to listen to some scientist or some person in mainstream media telling them what is the reality. So this is a time of inner awakening, inner knowing, finding your own path, finding your own balance. So that's the period that we are now going to go into as we come out of the Kali Yuga.
And so we're talking about a consciousness shift for the entire planet. And so what I would like to do really quickly, because for those that may not have any idea what this is, to go in a little bit deeper on it, is, so basically break down, this is a combination of two things. For those we'll get to later about the black hole cycle as well, but just focusing on the inner cycle there that you can see. So just kind of break down for us what we're talking about here. And the 24,000 year cycle, or 25,800, depending on which one we're talking about, and explain what that means. So what is each section, and what does it mean ultimately? So again, the terms you're seeing on this graph are representative of and you'll say them again, I'm sure, of the golden, silver, bronze, and iron, or as it says there, Tetra, Dwarpa, Kali, and was the other one, and Satya, as I'm saying it correctly. Satya, yeah. Satya, thank you. And so basically representing the kind of the decline in consciousness, and then beginning back on the ascending cycle where consciousness increases. So kind of break that down for me on the time frames, what that means, just kind of quick overview for people.
Right. So the Satya Yoga is the golden age. So that ended by around 10,900 BCE. And after that, it was followed by what we now known as the Younger Dryas period, when our planet was, there was basically freezing cold all over our planet. And current discoveries indicate that we were hit by a very large comet at that Younger Dryas boundary. And that kind of killed off all the Ice Age megafauna. And it triggered that cooling period of nearly 1200 years. And now there's evidence that there were comet impacts throughout that period, which kind of started of wildfires, and we find evidence of that within that strata. There's a black mat at that particular stratigraphic layer, which shows the kind of events that we went through as a planet during that period. And after that 1200-year period ended, that's what we know as the end of the last ice age at around 9700 BCE. And that was the beginning of what we know as the descending cycle of consciousness, because the golden age was over, went through this period of cataclysm. That was when the flood event occurred, and there's evidence for that flood as well in the black mat. And then we went into this descending cycle of consciousness, which is Treta is the Silver Age, then the Dwapara is the Bronze Age, and then you have two back-to-back Kali Yugas, which are two Iron Ages. And each of these yugas are of 2,700 years duration, and between these two yugas you have a period of transition of around 300 years. That's when the older yuga or the older age, that kind of collapses, that gives way to the new age. So for instance, if you look at the Kali Yuga, you don't have the dates on this particular diagram, because I have dates in my book and some of the other diagrams on my website as well. So this particular date here, the beginning of the Kali Yuga, on the Kali Yuga portion that we are in right now, that started at around 676 BCE, or let's say 700 BCE. That's what we know as the Iron Age civilizations, all of which began almost simultaneously at around 700 BCE, whether it's in Greece or Persia or India. And the one prior to that is at around 3676 BCE. That's the descending Kali Yuga. And that corresponds to the rise of all the Bronze Age civilizations. So we see that this framework, it ties up with the known pattern and the known growth and evolution of civilizations that we have found out from historical and archaeological sources. And each of these civilizations, whether it's the Bronze Age civilization, all the Bronze Age cultures, all the Bronze Age cultures, whether it's in Egypt or India or Mesopotamia, they all collapsed between, let's say, around 1100 to 700 BC. We don't have any trace of those civilizations anymore. So that's what we know as the transitional period, when the older civilizations kind of collapse. We lose the art and the mathematics and the cultural beliefs and the religion of that time. And when the new cycle starts, then we come up with a new set of architectural ideas, new artistic expressions, new religious beliefs. And all of that for the Iron Age started at around 700 BCE. In India, we had Buddha come up with his own religious philosophy at around 500 BCE. And then in Western world, Christ came at around 0 BCE and so on. So we have these cycles, and these cycles have a beginning and ending time. And we are right now at a cycle which is the ascending Kali Yuga, which means that the devolution of consciousness still continues, because it's a part of the Kali Yuga, the lowest point. Devolution of consciousness is going on, but at the same time, there's an improvement in the material conditions of life. So it's ascending in a material sense. And if somebody looks at our civilization only in material terms, then he might think that we're already in a higher age or in a higher cycle. But from the point of view of consciousness, we are still declining. And it's only in terms of our technology, our material prosperity, and also our lifespans have been increasing slightly over the last 2000 years, because during at around 700 BC, the average lifespan had hit a low of around 50 years, 45 years. Those were the average lifespans. And since then, it has been gradually increasing to around 80 or 85 years now. And it wasn't due to vaccines or medicines or anything like that. It happened naturally as a part of this this consciousness cycle. And it's this particular cycle, as I mentioned in the book, is governed by energy coming in from the central black hole or the galactic center, which we can talk about later.
So that's very interesting. In the cycle, the descending and ascending cycle, which again, what we're looking at here is, so we're basically at this ending part of the ascending side of the Kali Yuga, and we're about to go into this, which we'll talk about in a second. But so explain for me what so we have the different 2,700 year on this side, the a descending cycle. So it means consciousness is decreasing, less abundance, more strife in general. And then what are the 300-year periods in between, and what does that represent? And then let's go to what the, how do you say that? Ekpyrosis?
Ekpyrosis, yeah.
Yeah, what that would be, and whether that's, the difference of those things. But so explain the 300-year gaps in between and why that's relevant to where we are right now.
Yeah, 300-year gaps are the periods when one civilization or one phase or one yuga gives way to the next. So the previous one was when we moved from the Bronze Age cultures, which collapsed between 1100 to 700 BCE. That was the previous transitional period. And one prior to that was when the Neolithic cultures, they all collapsed between 4000 to 3500 BCE. And it's only after that do you see the rise of the Bronze Age civilizations in Egypt or Sumer or Mesopotamia. The Neolithic civilizations all disappeared in those areas. So those are the 300-year transitional periods when the older cultures kind of collapse due to a variety of factors. A lot of them are environmental and cosmic in nature, not necessarily economic or social, although all of them play an important factor. But the main impulse comes from outer space in the form of impact events.
Comets and meteors and
yeah, that's one of the main factors, because even volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, they can be triggered by impact events. Although we can't always say that's a thing that happens every time. There could be some transitions where maybe earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are playing an important role. For instance, if you read the Hopi view of the four cycles, they have these four worlds, and they talk about earthquakes happening at the end of the first world, and then water and floods at the end of the second world. So a lot of factors come into play, and but what I found is that impact events are a very important component of that. And now that we're coming to the end of the Kali Yuga, and the end of the Kali Yuga is also the end of the entire descending cycle of consciousness. So this is a very big and important transition for us. It's not like the smaller transitions that happened earlier. This is a big transition, and these big transitions are of 1200 years duration. The last one was when the golden age had ended, or the Satyuga had ended. That's the time we went through this period called the Younger Dryas. The Greeks referred to this period as cataclysms, which means deluge. So they said that this was the time that the earth was renewed by water and ice.
By
the Great Flood. And so now we are going into the period called Ekpyrosis, which is diametrically opposite to that 1200-year period. And Ekpyrosis means burning or conflagration. So this is time that planet is going to be renewed by fire. So you might see a lot of fire events, which is something that has been happening over the last few months. And that's a sign that we are about to enter into this period of Ekpyrosis, when the cleansing is going to happen by fire. But the other thing is that in my book, what I pointed out is, even though the transitional period is 1200, it doesn't mean that we are just going to burn over 1200 period. What it means is that there's this external fire, and there's also an internal fire. The internal fire is the fire of wisdom and fire of knowledge. So that's going to purify us as well. And the internal fire is going to be kind of lit, or the impulse for the internal fire is going to come from the galactic center, the energetic emanations from the galactic center, which has already started, by the way. We have found out that the central black hole has become active over the last 1 year, and it's giving out very bright flares in the visible spectrum, which never happened before. Till now, the black hole was very silent, and it is to give out X-ray flares, occasional X-ray flares. And over the last 1 year, it's been giving out very bright flares on a daily basis.
Hmm.
So it means it's getting switched on, and that energetic impulse is coming to our planet, and that's going to rekindle our inner knowing, the awakening, the intuitive faculties. And yeah,
That
so that's the period we're going into right now, the pyresis or the cleansing by fire. And in my book, what I said is that most of uh, the big changes, the most of the uh, changes that pertain to the collapse of the existing civilization is probably going to be accomplished in a very short period of time, between 2025 to 2040, a 15-year window between 2025 to 2040, when that's probably going to happen. And after that, it's just going to be a long cooling down period when the foundational beliefs and structures and philosophies of the ascending cycle are established.
Yeah, it's just fascinating, and I'm definitely going to come back to the black hole discussion, which the outside of this graph is representing, and that I find that really, really interesting. And this is what I find so fascinating about all of this, and the way you write in the book, that there's very clearly, however you want to look at a mythos, a religious perspective, but there's also very, very undeniable historical documented parts of this that completely align with that, which is just incredible. So the interesting part about the black hole discussion and the genetic and different potential changes that can cause, we'll come back to that for sure. I find that fascinating. But I'd like to say one more on this, and basically, so it's interesting to reiterate kind of what I was just saying there, if you could. The interesting part about this, that, so basically what you're describing there, and that you make great lengths to point out in your book and source it all, is that all these different gaps, the different cycles, and then the 300-year periods in between, you can cite these different moments, as you pointed out, these large flood events or different cataclysms, and then you can show that there's been all of a sudden a kind of simultaneous rise of different major civilizations in Egypt and everywhere else all at the same time. And then again with these little gaps. And so just interestingly, from a anthropological standpoint, you can prove that that's the case. And so it's interesting, and I guess explain what you think that means, I guess, and why that would be so consistent, but then overlap that with the religious perspective or the mythos around it from other cultures, and what that mind says, from the biblical perspective, or like you mentioned, the Hopis, or these different overlaps of it. Give me a little more on that for people to understand.
Yeah, before we go there, I'd like to add one more thing, and that's that's about the decline in our physical size as well as our cranial capacities. Because see, what the ancients have been telling us is that we have declined in consciousness, and we have also declined in intelligence. Our memory has declined substantially, because the ancients used to remember everything orally. They used to basically remember all the knowledge and all the information and transmit it orally to the next generations. And it's only in the last few hundred years that we have started writing in a big way. And the other thing that they always tell us is that the people in the ancient times, they used to be much bigger and stronger than us, and they could pull off incredible tasks of engineering or other things which we can't do today. And then when I looked at the data, I found that both of those are valid. In the last 12,000 years, we have lost nearly 10 to 17% of our cranial capacity. Do you know that and this comes all over the world. They have looked at thousands of human crania, 9,000 or 10,000 human crania over the last 12,000 years. And what they've found is that men on an average have lost 10% of their cranial capacity, and women have lost around 17% of their cranial capacity over this period. And this is the same amount of cranial capacity which we supposedly had gained as a species during our long evolution from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens over a period of 2 million years. And they can't explain that. They can't explain why we have lost so much cranial capacity in a period of 12,000 years. And we know that cranial capacity is a measure of our intelligence. It's a measure of our memory. It's also a measure of many of the subtle abilities that we don't have today, like intuition or clairvoyance or telepathy, which people in the higher ages had. So we've lost all of that, and it's there in the data. And the anthropologists and the evolutionary scientists, they hardly ever speak about it. They know about it, but they don't talk about it. The information is there in the journals. Anybody can go and look it up, but they don't talk about it because they can't explain it. It goes completely against the Darwinian model of evolution. And what I've written in my book is that we never went in a straight line from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. What happens is that in a 25,800 year cycle, our cranial capacity goes up and down over 2 million years. So when you look at the cranial capacity of the Cro-Magnon, which that's a Homo sapien ancestor who lived around 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, they occupy the peak of the previous golden age. That's why they had cranial capacities of around 1600 cc, which is comparable to the cranial capacity of our Ice Age ancestors. That's because they lived in a previous golden age. That's why they had very large cranial capacities. And that's why they keep coming up with human skeletons with very high cranial capacity. They recently found a cranium of around 1600 cc, which is around 120,000 years old. That's not supposed to be there if we have gone in a linear fashion. They keep coming up with these kind of very high cranial volume specimens, and they can't explain it using their model. And the only way you can use it is if you assume that it's going up and down in a sinusoidal manner over 25,800 years. And the same thing is about our physical height. We have declined on an average by 10% from over the last 12,000 years. Our physical size has declined, our bone strength has declined, our athleticism has declined. And they can't explain that as well. Why have we declined in size? And 10%, I think, is an underestimation, because there is a very big proclivity to toss out those skeletons which are too large. So every time they come across a skeleton which is like 10 to 15 feet in height, they just toss it out. They call it as an anomaly, and it's not considered within the calculation. So 10% is an underestimation. I think it's probably 20 to 25% decline in physical size. And if you look at the Ice Age megafauna, they were also really big, and the humans of that time were also equally big. We have all lost in physical size, and that's what the Yuga Cycle doctrine, or that's what Plato, that's what Pliny, all the ancient historians, they always said that we have become smaller than our ancestors, and that's true. But do you hear about that in your in school, on college, or is it taught anywhere? Is it discussed on mainstream media? It's not, but it's a fact. Anybody can go and check out the facts. They have looked at hundreds of thousands of specimens in the Eastern Mediterranean region. They looked at thousands of specimens in Northern Europe. Everywhere the trend is the same. You have declined in physical size by 10%. They're saying 10%, but I think it's 10 to 20%. And the other thing is that when you look at the skeletons around 12,000 years ago, there's no sign of violence, nothing at all. It's only around 7,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago do you see skulls which have been broken up by something hitting it very powerfully. So you see signs of violence and warfare coming up much later in the cycle. But the earlier you go back 12,000 years, 10,000 years, there's no sign of warfare. Other thing, there's no sign of endemic diseases.
Right.
All the people who lived in the around 12,000, 13,000, 40,000 years ago, no diseases at all. And it's around maybe around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, do you find all of these endemic diseases coming up, hookworm or maybe dental diseases and stuff like that. So when the ancients tell us that our ancestors were bigger than us, stronger than us, fitter than us, more intelligent than us, had better, higher memories than us, and that the environment itself was so good that people did not have diseases and they lived for a very long time, it's not a myth. These are all facts, and you can look at the data yourself and figure it out. Which is why after I wrote the book, nobody came and challenged me, because I cited all the sources in my book.
Exactly.
And,
that's why it's always so important to cite material like that. What's so fascinating about that, and again, for those that, want to challenge that, look into this. It's very fascinating to see how much evidence there really is around that exact conversation, and which correlates to the point he made earlier about the descending, ascending cycles, where at the golden age, as you write in the book, it was abundance and, enough food for everybody, no strife, no disease. That's exactly what he's saying, as you can prove that in the data. But what I found most fascinating about that point, which you cite in the book, which is that now, since we have gone into the ascending side, weirdly enough, you're starting to see, like I think you said, about an average of an inch gain in a general sense in height. And so my point was that made all of it for me right there, because if we're going to believe this is an, kind of an evolutionary, change, then why would it all of a sudden, in correlation with the ascending beginning, suddenly start going back up? And that's one of the point you make. Nobody wants to admit that or point to it. I find that
exactly. Our lifespan, it made a turnaround when we went into the ascending Kali Yuga. That's the time the life suddenly started increasing. Our physical size has increased a little bit the moment we crossed that 600 BC time frame. We started becoming bigger in size. But our cranial capacity has been declining till now, and it's about now that in some populations around the world that you find that the cranial capacity is kind of flattening out, and we might go into an upward trajectory very soon. So
Well,
all of the data supports the idea of a Yuga cycle, or a cycle of the ages, or whatever you want to call it. And the duration of this cycle is equal to 25,800 years, which is the duration of the precession cycle of the Earth. And the precession cycle is, let me try and explain it very simply. Uh, on the spring equinox date, right now, the sun appears in the foreground of the Pisces constellation. The sun is in Pisces right now. Today, if you look at the sun, it will be at the beginning of the Pisces constellation. Now, you would think that every time we come back, complete a circle around the sun and come back to the same point, the constellation in the background should be the same. But it's not. It keeps on changing. The background constellation keeps on changing. So in a couple of 100 years, the background constellation on March 21st will be Aquarius. In another 2000 years after that, the background constellation will be Capricorn. So in this way, the background constellation keeps on changing very slowly over time. So over a 25,800 year cycle, we move around the entire zodiac. The background constellation keeps on shifting, and we complete a revolution around the entire zodiac, and that's called the precession cycle. This was one of the very important cycles that all the ancient societies measured and tracked, because it's the same as the Yuga cycle, and by knowing the position at a particular time, they would be able to say whether which part of a particular Yuga we are in. Yeah, that's the diagram. So on March 21st, you see these are the zodiac constellation, and they encircle the solar system like a giant ring. So let's say we are here on March 21st, 2025, and we look at the sun. The background constellation is Pisces. But in a few hundred years, the on the March 21st, the spring equinox date, you'll find that the background constellation has changed to Aquarius. Now, the current theory is that the Earth, it actually moves slowly backwards along its orbit over time. In other words, from equinox to equinox, it does not complete a complete 360-degree revolution. It completes 359 degrees certain minutes. So it's not a complete 360-degree revolution. So that keeps on adding up over time, so that the background constellation keeps on shifting. So, and in my book, what I said is that that cannot be the correct explanation, because if we were actually moving back along the orbit, then the dates of the meteor showers should have also changed, because the meteor showers intersect our orbit at very specific points. And if the planet is moving backwards along the orbits, then dates that those showers occur should have changed over time, but that hasn't happened. All the meteor showers, they occur at the same time as they used to around 500 or 600 years ago. So the theory that I have proposed in my book is that the entire solar system revolves around its axis as it moves around the galactic center. We know that we think of the solar system as a flat planetary disk, but the solar system actually is a spherical structure, because it is enclosed by a cloud of comets that we know as the Oort cloud. So when you think of the entire system, including the Oort cloud, it looks like a sphere, a spherical structure. And every spherical structure in the world, in the universe rather, rotates on its axis when it revolves, because it needs to conserve the initial angular momentum. So our solar system must also rotate on its axis as it goes around the galactic center. And if it does that, then it's going to create this phenomena of precession, in which the background constellations will appear to move slightly backwards.
Yeah, the amount of overlap with this is just fascinating to me, and how it connects. But so bringing it back to the kind of the religious connotation around it, before we get into more like how it connects to today and different points about the black hole. So just give me a quick and this is probably one of you could probably talk for 6 hours about the overlaps of the mythos and history, but give me some of the bigger overlapping points to, like a biblical reference to the floods, or how it relates to like the religious perspective, and how that might intertwine with the actual timeline that we can prove.
Yeah, see, if you look at all the traditions, the biblical tradition or the Indian tradition or human tradition, they all talk about a flood that happened at the end of the golden age. So that they're all clear about that. Now, the end of the golden age was followed by what I call, what the Greeks knew as the period of cataclysms, and what scientists now know as the Younger Dryas period. Now, what they've found is that at the Younger Dryas boundary, there's a thick layer of black mat. It spans that entire 1200 years of the Younger Dryas. And that particular black mat was deposited not because of, it's not a sign of burning. What happened was that uh, the entire earth was covered with water, and there was a lot of algae which bloomed in that water.
Mm.
And when those algae died, they went down with the water, and that black color comes from all the dead algae
Hmm.
that bloomed during this period. And one of the important, one of the most well-respected, I should say, geologists is Vance Jr., and he's very highly respected. What he said was that throughout the Younger Dryas period, we did not have dry conditions. We had very wet conditions, and large parts of the world was flooded, and which came as a very big surprise to me, because we should not have been having that kind of flooding during the Younger Dryas period, because the glaciers were advancing. We know that the glaciers were advancing. The sea level was also increasing, but very slowly. In that case, the groundwater should have gone down. The groundwater shouldn't have bubbled over. And Vance Jr. is saying, what he's saying is that the groundwater was full to the brim and it was bubbling over, and that's why you had flooding all over the world. But the
Hmm.
groundwater shouldn't have been bubbling over. The groundwater should have gone down, because where do you find the water for the increasing ocean level and the advancing glaciers? These are the three main sources of water on our planet. The first is seawater, which is salt water, and the fresh water is locked up mainly in the glaciers and the groundwater. Rivers and lakes, they don't count for anything. That's less than 0.03% or something. So you can forget about that. So it's glaciers and groundwater for fresh water, and for salt water, you have sea. Glaciers were advancing, sea levels were going up, groundwater has to go down. There's no
Hmm.
other way. So why was the groundwater flowing over? Why was it overflowing? My thesis is that the comet which came at the Younger Dryas boundary and all the other comets that followed, they brought the water. And this is not a new theory, because all scientists admit that when our Earth was initially formed, it did not have any water. And it's comets who brought that water from
Hmm.
outer space. And the ratio of heavy water and normal water that we have in our oceans is same as the ratio of heavy water and normal water inside comets. So comets brought the water to the early Earth. And what I'm saying is that comets also brought that water to the Earth during that Younger Dryas cataclysm, and they caused the flood. And so basically a huge amount of water was injected into our ecosphere at that point of time. That created the flood, and then that water went down, and the groundwater was completely filled over. And that's why throughout the Younger Dryas period, it was wet and marshy throughout the world. And that created that black layer that we find there. So there is very good geological evidence for the flood as well in the Younger Dryas layer.
And as well as, like I said, many other examples you cite that overlap with very clear historical timelines. But and you also mentioned one example as well that could have answered at least some points in that around. I think you mentioned, I think it was like an ice wall that possibly got hit by a comet that then let out a lot of water that was held inside of the glacial areas that flooded major areas, Mesopotamia. All these different
Yeah.
points. I mean, this part is so fascinating to me because it's amazing how little, like you say, like this doesn't get addressed enough, seeing as how it does very clearly relate to things that are considered more myth than real, which is fascinating to me. But so let's go ahead. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, and then we are talking about the biblical references.
Mm-hmm.
The other reference is about lifespans. Both the biblical and the Indian references tell us that in the higher ages, people lived longer. They lived around, in the Indian sources, it's basically 400 years in the golden age, then 300, 200, and then 100 years in the Kali Yuga, which is the age we're in right now. Those are the average ages. And then again, it goes back up. And if you look at the biblical sources, it's like 900 years, and then comes down gradually to 800, 700 years, and around 1500 BC, the time of Isaac, I think it reaches around 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a gradual decline in the lifespans. And what I found out is that when you go back to the early Egyptian sources, the pharaohs at that time used to live around 100, 110 years. 110 years, if you look at the Old Kingdom text, 110 years was regarded as the ideal lifetime for a king or a pharaoh. And that was like at the beginning of the Old Kingdom, around 3000 BCE. But around 1000 BCE, towards the end of the Egyptian kingdom, uh, the average lifespan had come down to around 45 years. So from 100 years, it had come down to 45 years.
Hmm.
And then, as I spoke earlier, from 45, it has now gone back up to around 80, 85 years now. So this whole idea that the lifespan of our ancestors was much longer than the current lifespan is also very true. And in some places like Okinawa in Japan, which is in that
Right.
blue zone, people are already living past 100 pretty regularly. And if you
Mm-hmm.
look at their lifestyle, they're still following the traditional lifestyle of our ancestors, and they're not so much into the kind of lifestyle that we have in the cities in the modern world today.
And what's interesting to note is that the argument being that, we've progressed technologically in medicine, and that's why we can expand our lifespan, but it doesn't really make sense why they would be living to 110 in that period. It's interesting. But let's touch on actually the spiritual part of this, and in how, because I want to go into like the real world overlaps to this, but so what is the idea in regard to the spiritual side of this, and what we're trying to attain, right? And so the idea that this is about the cleansing of the earth because we've kind of fallen away from our spiritual connection, or however you would frame that. So what is the mindset from that perspective, and what this is about?
Well, if you look at again, if you read the ancient texts, what they talk about is one of the fundamental driving factors in the higher ages was dharma, or righteousness. And then you say, what is dharma? Dharma means that you don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. That was one of the guiding principles. And then Jesus said that slightly differently: do to others what you want others to do to you. So you treat others the same way you want others to treat you, sorry. And we have gone very far away from those principles because we generally tend to react to any particular situation based on our selfish needs and our perspectives, and we don't really consider the opinion or thoughts or beliefs or emotions of other people, including our planet or our environment. So we don't give that equal respect to our environment either. So we have fallen away from dharma as we have progressed down that cycle. And if also and the reason why we have fallen away from dharma is we have moved away from connection to our inner spirit. So what the ancients tell us is our soul or our self or our inner spirit, it is the seat of virtue. So in the ancient times, people tried to connect with the spirit through various spiritual techniques like yoga or meditation, or nature, spending time in nature, or chanting or music, or listening to wisdom teachers, things like that. A lot of techniques are there, and they try to reconnect with their inner spirit. And when you do that, you are filled with joy and wisdom and love and truth, and all the virtues are there. So your mind becomes flooded with those virtues, and then you radiate those virtues to the outer world. And they measured the worth of a person by how virtuous he was, and not by how rich he was or how powerful he was. So the worth of a person was determined by what he gave to the world, what we did for the world, how many persons I've inspired, how much I have given, how much I have helped, and not by how much I have acquired or hoarded. So the fundamental thinking was very different in the higher ages, and that thinking has now devolved into my personal power, the power and the wealth of my society, the wealth of my country. That has now the GDP. GDP is like the prime driving factor for countries today, and in the higher ages, that was not the case at all. It was virtue that was the main driving factor. And out of that virtue came certain abilities, which we call as siddhis or yoga siddhis, which are basically miraculous powers that you have when you advance very highly along this particular path. And then you can do miracles. I mean, when you read, again, if you want a biblical reference, you hear about Jesus doing these miracles. In Buddhism, you hear about Buddha doing these miracles. So those were at the beginning of the Kali Yuga, and even at that point, it was possible to demonstrate some of those miraculous powers. But since we have devolved even more over the last 2000 years, it's very difficult right now, even for a person who's deeply connected to his soul, to manifest those kind of powers, because those powers kind of go away in the descending cycle. So right now, so when we are on the ascending cycle, we need to reconnect with our inner spirit. That's the primary objective, because once you reconnect with the inner spirit, then you automatically start living in dharma, in righteousness, because otherwise it's very difficult to follow. Someone might say, yeah, that sounds fine, I should treat others the way I want others to treat me, but in real life situations it's very difficult to implement that. In real life situations, you're always going back to what is good for me, what is it that I need, and the other person can go to hell, right? So that thinking of what is actually right, what is actually for the greater good, that instinct doesn't come natural. That instinct has to be developed consciously, and then we can act in accordance with dharma. And when you are in touch with your inner spirit, you're automatically in touch with the spirit of the world, with our planet, and you realize that you shouldn't be exploiting the planet in this manner, the way we are exploiting it right now, kind of pollution and the harm that we are doing to our world. We implicitly realize that, and all indigenous societies always talk about this, right? They always talk about living in harmony and balance with the planet, because what we give out comes back to us. So if you're exploiting it, then at some time the planet is also going to turn back against you, which is what has been happening over the last few years. So it's about getting back into balance within ourselves, and once we get back into balance within ourselves, then the environment also falls into balance. The outer world is a reflection of our inner world. So if there's a turmoil in the inner world, that's going to get magnified in the outer world, so that's going to lead to the wars and violence. So if you're looking at the world leaders and saying, why are they fighting against each other, that's a magnification of what is actually going on within our own minds, our own consciousness. It's a magnification of that.
And so the break periods and the cataclysms that take place, from I guess more of the mythos around it, the idea is that this is because we've fallen away from that connection, the oneness, the interconnectivity, and ultimately, the spiritual, connection, that's now wiped, and then civilizations repopulate, and like in an effort to kind of reach that. And so I was maybe going to touch on this at the end, but it's just perfect for this conversation right now. Is there not, like, how do you read that from like your own personal perspective, whether belief or just, anthropological evidence? Like, what do you believe is the purpose of this? Is this, like, my thought was like, whether this feels like something that we're supposed to be striving to attain, as in, if we could successfully not have our consciousness fall away, could that mean that we supersede this cycle? Like, how do you see that, and why the breaks, and is that just the way that it will go forever, or is, how do you see that in your mind?
Yeah, thing is that there are two reasons why we have those breaks in the cycle. One is to renew and rejuvenate the planet, because planet itself needs to be renewed on a regular basis and return to its original pristine state. That's one of the reasons. And second is that on the descending cycle, over a period of over the duration of the yuga, there's a lot of evil that comes up naturally over the descending cycle, and so that cleansing is also part of the cleansing of the evil and the people who are causing harm to the planet. But on the ascending cycle, you may not necessarily have those kind of breaks that you have on the descending cycle. I don't see any particular reason for that, unless it could be a period when there's kind of a dormancy. There's not too much human activity, just to allow our planet to kind of rejuvenate itself, because our planet does that automatically as long as humans are not messing it up. Like during the pandemic itself, over a period of 2 years, a lot of places were looking much fresher and cleaner and greener. So that's one of the reasons why we have those cleansing periods. The reason why we have to go through this particular cycle is because we need to learn from the darkness as well as from the light. The kind of lessons that we learn in the descending cycle are not the same as the kind of lessons that you're going to learn in the ascending cycle. In the descending cycle, you have to deal with a lot of distractions. So you have to have a very strong willpower. So you have to deal with a lot of corruptions and violence. So you need to develop your patience and maybe your forgiveness. Those are the virtues that you develop. But in the ascending cycle, the conditions of life are so much better. Everybody is at a higher state of consciousness. So that is the time that you develop your ability to maybe meditate, to maybe acquire those higher powers that you don't have now. So the kind of learning that we have in course of this cycle keeps on changing. And the ultimate objective is that at a certain point, we learn enough, we come into our own, we recover our divine heritage. So no matter whatever is going on in the outer world, we remain connected to our inner self, and we radiate that truth, that wisdom, that love, and that compassion, that honesty, that integrity to the outer worlds. So in that case, there's no need for you to go through the cycle anymore, because
Mm.
our planet, what the ancients tell us, is basically like a school for the evolution consciousness. So
Right.
you come here for a small period of time, you spend
Okay.
some time learning, and then you go back to your ancestors, your star family, you spend some time there, you're happy there, then you don't want to come back, and they force you to come back again because it's time for the classes next day, so you're kind of screaming and coming back again. And then again you're going through this learning period, and then at some point you have learned enough, you're ready to graduate, and that's what they call nirvana or moksha or whatever. And then you come out of this cycle, you go back to your star family, and then you do something else somewhere. I mean, we live in a vast universe. Our planet is
Hmm.
just a speck in the dust, and so there's a lot of stuff for you to do elsewhere in the universe as well. So but then you come into your own, so you become a god on earth. That's what this, because you're like a dormant god, you're waiting to recover your divinity, and once you do that, you exit the cycle, and then you do something else elsewhere. Maybe you guide the evolution of civilizations elsewhere, because
Mm.
that's what the ascended masters do. That we call them sages or the ascended masters. They guide civilizations, maybe our own planet, or maybe in other planetary civilizations. You guide those civilizations there.
That's very interesting. You kind of just open. So I opened my mind to something I hadn't considered in that context. So it's basically that this is more so. I guess that would more align with some Eastern perspectives on like a reincarnation idea, right? Where essentially this is a momentary in the blip of your existence kind of moment where you're stepping into this. That's interesting. So I guess what that answers my question is that I was asking you whether there was a way to sort of like supersede the cycle, and that's ultimately the answer. But for more of like a Western like biblical perspective, it's like the question of like the end times versus like the ongoing cycle. But it's interesting how all this kind of comes together. But as you mentioned that about like the prophet, sage, avatar, as you mentioned in the book, since you bring that up, there has been some examples of people that argue that they are the incarnation of that, right? In the past so many years. And so can you touch on that for a second on what that means and the relevance of that for, because you mentioned at least a couple different cultures that believe that as of like right now today, March 21st forward, that there's supposed to be sort of the return of some of these sages or different examples of that. So can you touch on that for me?
Yeah, we are basically going into the end of the Kali Yuga, and so every tradition, every culture tells us that there's going to be the return of some avatar or some prophet, like the return of Christ, or in India we call the return of the Kalki avatar. The Hopi talk about the Pahana who is going to come back. And then I looked into all of those mythos and all of those stories, and it seems that they are see this entire cycle is controlled by some higher powers. That's something you need to accept, because without the acceptance of that, you kind of get lost in the whole thing. There's some higher powers who are controlling this whole cycle, not only the evolution of human civilization, but also the journey of souls across lifetimes. That entire cycle is controlled by higher powers, because this is a school, and there are teachers, and there are caretakers, and there are all kinds of stuff members looking at this. That's what we call as the gods and the angels, and or that entire hierarchy. Uh, so that hierarchy is going to reveal itself. But how's that going to happen? My reading of the text tell me that there are certain comets within the Taurid resonance swarm, which get activated. Now, the Taurid resonance swarm is a swarm of comets within the Taurid meteor stream. And what astronomers have found out is that every 2,500 to 3,000 years, we pass through the center of that swarm. And when we do that, we get kind of impacted over a period of 200 or 300 years, which ties up perfectly well with what I found in the Yuga Cycle framework, that every 2,700 years, we have these periods of transition. Now, we are going to pass through that swarm in the years 2032 and 2036. And my feeling is that during those times, some of these comets, they could get activated. Now, comets do that a lot. They become dormant, then become activated. And that is going to, and these comets were described in the form of animals. Some comets are described
Mm.
as horses. There's a horse comet, which brings about the downfall of evil tyrants. There's a bird comet, which brings a lot of abundance, like the phoenix. So comets, when they get activated, they look very different. Some of them can look like a horse, some look like a dragon, some look like a bird. And the ancients always used to say that our gods, they ride through the sky on these kind of animals. Somebody like Marduk, he rides a dragon. In India, Vishnu rides a bird called Garuda. Then Horus is basically a falcon. So what are these birds that they were talking about? What I proposed is that these birds are basically comets which get activated, and they come to our planet during these transitional periods, and they do a lot of stuff. They do a lot of cleansing. And these comets, they don't act on their own. They're guided by these higher forces to carry out the particular cleansing that is necessary. And then these divine entities, they reveal themselves. Now, I don't know whether they reveal themselves while the cleansing is going on or prior to that, or whether after that. That's something that we just have to wait and watch. But I feel that the cleansing is going to be done by comets, and these are the sources of the return of Christ on a horse. That horse is basically a comet. The return of Kalki riding on a horse, holding a sword. The horse is a comet, and a comet has two tails. One of is that curvy dust tail. That's the part that looks like a horse. And there's a straight blue iron tail. That's the part that looks like a sword or a spear. So those are the symbolisms that a lot of these cultures were describing, that of the return of a particular comet to carry out the cleansing. And they were also telling us these comets, they don't act alone. They are guided by a higher power. That's the God. This is just the spirit animal, or the animal, mount of that particular God. So that's the way I have interpreted the ancient symbolism. And which is why, from my perspective, the 2 days, 2032 and 2036, are very important in this transition out of the Kali Yuga. And recently they discovered a asteroid 2024 YR4, which they thought is going to strike us in 2032, but it's not going to strike us. Ultimately, they found that the chance is very low. But at least what it does is that it puts that particular date into the public consciousness, that this date is somehow important to us. It's a message from the universe that look out for that date. There's another asteroid called Apophis. Apophis is going to make two very close pass-bys our planet, flybys our planet in 2029 and 2036. So that again brings up the importance of the 2036 date, which I feel is very critical. In Apophis is not going to hit us, but I think Apophis is again a message sent to us that these dates are important. And if you look at the time difference between 2029 and 2036, that's like 7 years, and that I think could be the 7 years of tribulation in the biblical prophecies. So we could be heading towards that particular phase, and that again ties up very nicely with the WEF plan. According to them, they're trying to bring in the global government by 2030, when you'll own nothing and be happy. And some of the recent rhetoric from the European countries tell us that they're aiming for a big war with Russia by 2029 and 2030. So things are kind of heating up in that direction, and they're kind of lining up with that time period between 2029 to 2036, when we might see some really big, powerful, transformative changes, as opposed to now, because what you might see now is more gradual changes in our consciousness as the energy keeps coming in, more gradual changes in our environment, but it could all lead up to some big changes in that 7-year period.
Yeah, I don't think you need to convince anybody out there that we're going through some declines in. I mean, I think everybody's pretty kind of blown away by this, at least in my perspective, this kind of like decline, and I guess in the vibrational consciousness, like just this materialistic, self-serving kind of, and it's our governments around the world. And so it's really fascinating. So let's talk about that, and we'll come back to the black hole and, getting into like the scientific overlaps to this, so highlight that for us, and why you see that as relevant, not just the World Economic Forum in 2030, but just sort of a lot of the different government timeframes, the plans for even to 2020, 2030, like these different overlaps, and how that relates with, what this is. Like, do you think that means that they have some insight into this? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I've been asked this question before, and my feeling is that even if they knew about this actual cosmic timeline, they wouldn't care about it, because they don't believe in it. They don't believe that we are in ascending cycle, that we are coming out of an age of darkness. For them, we are at the pinnacle of civilization. They now want to use AI technology and those chips to turn humans into gods, and that's what they're saying very openly, that humans will be God, and we don't need that God in the clouds. So that's their philosophy. So even if they knew about the fact that we're coming out of the Kali Yuga, that there's going to be this passage through the storage form, and that the black hole is becoming active, it doesn't really matter to them. They don't care about it. So I think they don't really know about these timelines. What they're doing is they're kind of programmed to act like that, because there's a higher divine intelligence which is controlling this whole the manner in which this whole thing is playing out, and they are following their own timelines. And it just so happens that it's also coinciding with the with our emergence out of the Kali Yuga into the period of transition. So I think it's a coincidence. They don't really know about it. Even if they know about it, they wouldn't care about it.
Well, what's fascinating to me is that, and I would agree that it makes sense in the way that we understand all of this. But what's interesting is that, like talking about the black hole, we can get into right now, that these are scientific realities that I argue that I think we can understand that they're aware of, right? And so, if anything, at the very least, I would argue that this is the kind of mentality that's like, well, just in case, like, well, that put our mind in the clouds so nothing will happen. We can stay alive until the next golden age, or like, whatever the mindset would be of people that think like that. Or as you highlight in the book, the, building bunkers and different ideas that clearly seem to suggest that they at least perceive some coming cataclysm, whether or not it's related to the deeper spiritual understanding, And so speaking about the black hole, then in reality, to a scientific overlap to this that shows that there is a major change taking place, and how you can talk about the scientific connection to that, and how that, I think you mentioned like genetic changes and different, realities of what that kind of radiation coming from the black hole will do. And then back to this point, like whether you think that might at least some way influence what they think might be coming.
Yeah, the Yuga cycle, the decline and the decline of consciousness in the descending cycle, and the increase of consciousness. It's not just consciousness, as we said, it's basically the entire physical structure and environment. Everything changes in course of this cycle, and this is regulated by the radiation from the central black hole. The Vedic sages, the Indian sages, referred to this black hole as Brahma, the creative principle, and they said that Brahma is unformed, you can't see him, and it's a radiation from Brahma that that regulates this entire cycle. The end of the golden age till about let's say around 1000 BCE, the black hole had shut down. But the radiation from the black hole, it actually takes a long time to dissipate. So there's a light echo in the outer galaxy. So the light falls off very gradually. And so throughout this descending cycle, there's a slow decline in our cranial capacities, our physical size, and the environmental conditions.
And really quickly, just for those on the, so you can see on the screen for those watching and listening, that's where the AGN switch off phase, that's what the arrows right there are he's showing, and that ends right there at the point where the 300-year period between the Kali Yugas starts, and that's when the switch on phase starts, and that's after that going forward, he's arguing that's when this will be effectively happening. And so go ahead, continue, please. I just want to make sure they saw that relevance.
Yeah, then last 2000 odd years, the black hole has been in a switch on phase. In the switch on phase, it gives out sporadic radiation, especially X-ray radiations. And that's what the black hole has been doing over the last 600 odd years. That's what scientists have found out already. And now we are coming out of the Kali Yuga. And my proposition was that I wasn't 100% sure of it, but I was convinced that this must be it. And what I said is, when the Kali Yuga ends, we'll find that the black hole is switching on. And when the black hole switches on, it dramatic change. It starts emitting radiation at the visible spectrum, at the infrared spectrum, at the gamma rays. Basically, it starts radiating huge amount of EM rays at all spectrums, from infrared to gamma rays.
The correlation with that is insane. Like the idea that like we talked about with the increase in size after the ascending begins, there's far too many correlative points to ignore what this is, so now all of a sudden the reference, actually do me a favor and explain how important that actually is, the black hole, and what that is beyond the Yuga cycle to just how it affects humanity.
Yeah, so let me just finish this point. So what we have found is that that in the last 1 year, in between 2024 and 2025, the black hole has suddenly switched on. It's now giving out very bright flares of light on a daily basis, which means it is at the beginning phases of the AGN phase. And this is the AGN phase, what I shown in this particular diagram. And the AGN phase, what I said, is extend throughout the ascending cycle. And when that particular radiation, that high frequency radiation comes into our planet, that's when it triggers all the genetic mutations for increasing our cranial capacities, for increasing our physical size, our lifespan. And we also know that ionizing radiation kills off disease-causing germs, and that's why you don't have all those diseases in the higher cycle. And it also creates a lot of negative ions, and negative ions are very good for our mental well-being. So it all fits in. And what we have found is that the black hole has already switched on, and I expected it to happen sometime after 2025. I didn't exactly know when. I mean, it's a big thing, and it's already happened. So over the last 1 year, when I look back now, a lot of people have been talking about more spirituality, more intuitive understanding,
Right.
a lot people were talking about the premonitions of a big shift that they were getting. So the black hole was evidently triggering that already. uh, and
Yeah.
and what I think, what scientists believe is that the black hole, they gave the term black hole to that particular entity in the center of a galaxy, because they saw that it's giving out very high energy in the radio spectrum, and they thought that something so energetic has to be something like a black hole. But we've never really seen it. It doesn't gobble up anything. Einstein's black hole was supposed to gobble up matter around it. Our black hole has never been seen to gobble up matter. Einstein's black hole was supposed to suck in everything, even light. It was supposed to be black, but our black hole is giving out radiation at all frequencies. It doesn't behave like the Einsteinian black hole. So my feeling is that this is the primordial consciousness which drives the entire galaxy, and all of us, we emanate from this black hole as packets of consciousness that we call souls. And then once we complete our incarnations, we go back to that central black hole. At least we have the option to go back there, or we might continue in other planetary spheres. And then after some time, that's where we go back. So that's like the central source, central consciousness of our galaxy that's driving everything.
That's
And,
good.
and that nucleus, and when the black hole becomes active, what happens is that the central nucleus becomes extremely luminous. It's like the light coming out from the central nucleus is more powerful than the light from all the stars of our galaxy put together. So that's how bright it becomes. So that's when it becomes the central sun. And a lot of these ancient philosophies talk about a central sun of wisdom, which gives out divine light. In some of the mystery schools, they speak about a midnight sun. That's because this particular sun was visible in the night sky in the earlier ages. They could see this particular, it appeared as a second moon or a second sun. But at some point when the black hole switched off, they couldn't see it anymore. But the remembrance of that is still there, still encoded in ancient texts. They talk about the second sun, the sun of wisdom, which radiates intellectual light.
Wow.
So that's the phase that we are now going into, that not only is the black hole becoming active, at some point in the ascending cycle, we might, at the night time, we might see another moon-like. Okay, the other interesting thing, the angular width of the black hole as seen from the Earth is same as the angular width of the sun and the moon. So if the black hole, so if the central nucleus, not the black hole, the central nucleus. So if the central nucleus becomes visible in the night sky, it will be nearly as big as the full moon. So you might see two moons in the sky,
And
which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, so you clearly stating that at some point it should be visible to the naked eye. Do you happen to have any thought on when that might take place? Is that going to be soon, or thousands of years down this path?
Yeah, I can't say that really, because I didn't even expect the black hole to get switched on so quickly.
Yeah.
But maybe, I don't know, maybe another few hundred years, maybe during the period of Aquarius itself, it might become visible to us.
Yeah, that's just profound, man. I mean, it's so interesting. And this is what I want to reiterate, and why this is so interesting is that this is not the myth. This is scientific background that relates to this bigger point. And even like you're saying, like the timing of it being activated. And to reiterate, just in case you missed what he said, the idea that this is directly related to the decline in disease, the increase in our potential capacity, cranial capacity, our size. I mean, just the timing is just profound. I find that really fascinating. I'm going to leave this up. It looks like your video might have froze, so I'll just leave this up as we continue. But so in general, though, so bringing this back to the point of the perspective of the power structures. So you don't think this might play any factor on what they might think is coming, like in the sense of like, because whether the Yuga cycle conversation or not, there are historical timelines around cataclysm, right? And so I just wonder if you think that may be what they're trying to take action around, because you do mention in regard to like the nanotechnology, the kind of the technocratic direction, which to me very clearly seems like an attempt to kind of supersede their human limitations. So again, you think there's any connection to those two things?
Yeah, I think they might be aware that we are passing through they're possibly aware that we're passing through the Taurus swarm in 2032 and 2036.
Right.
That's astronomical information. So they might be planning to have a colony in Mars because of that. So that could be one of the things. And the bunkers, I think the main reason for the bunkers is probably because of the wars that they're planning to start. I mean, they're very clear that they want to go on an offensive mode in another 3 or 4 years. They want to regroup and kind of build up their military in the next 4 years and then go on offensive around 2020 and 2030. And maybe they're building the bunkers for that as well. But the bunkers obviously won't help, because it's not as if the laws of karma will stop working inside a bunker. So you're going to get what you deserve. You might be much better off, building a UFO landing pad in your backyard, because that's what might save you ultimately.
Well, so what's interesting on this is that, so what you're highlighting here is that we have the, in the descending, or just any process through one of these cycles, you have the decline or like the drifting away from that spiritual connection, or really just, I guess, more so on the ascending overall side of the cycle, we have the gradual increase of our consciousness and our vibrational, the way our general consciousness. But what's interesting, as you highlight in individual cycles, is that this will gradually come down to a point to where, as you're highlighting, strife increases, violence increases, and then gradually in different scales of the individual cycles. But so right now we're getting to one of those points where we're at the end of this, right? So you're highlighting that, again, technology is not an indication of the progress. So despite there being an increase in technology, that we are seeing a lot more of these things. But at the same time, this is where I find so fascinating that we're beginning the ascending longer scale, is that people are going to start to grow in that, like you're highlighting, people are waking up. They're questioning things. They're pushing back on these structures. They're finding these connections, spiritual and otherwise. So as we see more strife, weirdly, almost counterintuitively right now, we're going to see more pushback and more awareness. So I guess in a general way, just kind of end the conversation, for the average person out there, that whether or not they believe in the different aspects of this, we can feel the increase in those things, the strife and the conflict and the wars, so what is your advice to people out there, whether or not they believe in all this or they believe this really happening? We feel those things. So what do you argue people could do to try to, like, for example, you mentioned trying to tune in to the Dharma, the different vibrational changes. What is your advice for people out there that are trying to find a way through all of this?
Well, today we are coming out of the Kali Yuga, so the darkness is going to lift gradually. And what will happen is that people will automatically start waking up. I don't need to give them any advice. People will automatically start waking up. Their intuitive understanding is going to grow. They will figure out that there's something wrong with the world. And before you start thinking about the world, there's stuff that you need to fix within yourself, within your relationships, within your work sphere. So they'll start figuring out that, what, I need to get my life in order. This is not working for me. You'll see through the illusions. So you see through the deceptions and the illusions, and you'll figure out that, this is not working for me. I need to change direction maybe, and maybe go along this route. And once you start doing that, the doors will start opening up for you. The paths will get revealed. And so the energy and the force is with you right now. So you need to use that. You need need not feel fearful about what's happening in the outer world, because that's going to go away. And that's a conviction that I have, and that's a conviction I want to share with people as well, that that's going to go away. But what are you going to do about it? Are you making yourself ready for the higher age? So that's what we need to work on right now, make ourselves ready for the higher age. And we do that by becoming attuned to our higher self, to increase our worthiness, to be in the higher age. So that's what we do. And in order to do that, you need to, and this will happen automatically. You start asking the questions. You start trying to figure out, what is my path? What is it I need to do? How do I manifest my potential, my purpose? How do I establish good relationships with those around me? How do I establish good relationship with the planet? So how do I live with balance and love and truth and harmony? So these are questions people will ask themselves automatically right now, and those who are supposed to go in the right direction, they'll be kind of pulled in that direction by the energies. And those there's still going to be a lot of people who are going to resist this process. They won't believe in it. They will still cling to their old beliefs, their addiction to materialism, their addiction to divisions, to violence, because the power depends on the divisions. So many, everything in our world, power depends on the division. As long as you can keep the people divided, that's when you are powerful. And they're not going to let go of that that power. So they'll keep harping on the divisions. So there's going to be this polarization, and that's what all the Asian texts talk about as well. There's going to be a polarization, and there's going to be people who are trying to tune in to their own inner consciousness, to the cosmic consciousness, to the energies that are coming in. There will be people who won't do that, and ultimately there's going to be a showdown. I know that's what ultimately is going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that a lot of people, I mean, especially with what I think what our show tries to bring to the table, what a lot of people out there are trying to do, like I always talk about, just trying to be better and trying to improve yourself and trying to, find the deeper meaning. I think it's important to realize that these things have clearly, and at least in my perspective, and as you seem to feel as well, have been increasing. I think I've been saying this just in a worldly, like political sense. I've been highlighting how many different examples we see of people just questioning long-held perspectives, pushing back on different deceptions that we're all beginning to see that never before were called out. I mean, it is a really obviously positive change. And again, to always lean into a very overused analogy, like it's very, you can see, darker before the dawn kind of a feeling in all of this, where clearly things are in a way getting more intense, but at the same time, the overall beginning of something very positive seems to be taking place. And I really think that, like you said, it's about the internal, finding your own path in all of this. And I really want to lean into the part of a lot of different overlaps to this that you have in the book, the idea of the interconnectedness, the oneness, to realize that we're all part of something bigger, and that is ultimately what seems we're all striving for. And so I think this is very profound. And whether or not people out there believe that this is something deeper than just some astrological cycle or a planetary cycle, it's clear that there are bigger meanings to all of this that have continued to repeat themselves. And so I just hope people can consider that, at the very least, recognize that it's always a good time to try to better yourself and improve your spiritual connection, or however you see that. So I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this with us today. Any of the thoughts that you wanted to kind of touch on before we left today?
No, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. And that's a very pertinent point, that nobody has ever said that I regret becoming a more spiritual and peaceful and calm person. I wish I was the same anxious freak that I was before. Nobody has ever said that. So even if you don't believe anything that I'm saying, at least it's always good to change your perspectives and try to tune into your own higher self and find your own path, rather than fall into the propaganda, because the propaganda is not meant to serve you. The propaganda is meant to enslave you. That's the source of power. So you have to retain the sovereignty over consciousness, be true to your own higher self, and manifest your purpose, irrespective of whether you believe in the cycle or not.
Well said. Well said. Well, thank you again for being here. And I want to make sure we shout out your book here, Yuga Shift, The End of the Kali Yuga and the Impending Planetary Transformation. Very, very entertaining, but also very informative read. And I'll include the article that you recently put out that I referenced here today, as well as everything else we touched on. And I'll leave us with a quote from the book that I think is relevant to end with. And it says, as you pointed out, Dr. Robert Ghostwolf in the book, The Last Cry, Native American Prophecies and the Tales of the End Times, wrote, "The return of the blue star Kachina," I believe that's how it's pronounced, correct me if I'm wrong, who is also known as the Non-Ga Sohu, will be the alarm clock that tells us of the new day and new way of life, a new world that is coming. This is where the changes will begin. They will start as fires that burn within us, and they will burn up with desires and conflict if we do not remember the original teachings and return to the peaceful way of life. Just as one specific perspective from the Native American side of this, but the idea of just the larger, deeper kind of at many different cultures who all kind of see this idea of returning to being one, or rather, the synergistic way of living with the world around us. So thank you again for being here, brother. I appreciate this. And I really do think that as this continues forward, we should try to connect again. If there's anything else that, begins to happen that becomes more relevant, I'd love to have you back on to discuss that. So thanks again for being here. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.